Welcome to Unit 3 of EDSE 510. In this unit, we'll have a focus on several different areas of law related to disability and their connections to education and post-secondary planning. We also will have a discussion this week. You all have been doing a great job getting a hang of the discussion deadlines and expectations. Just remember that source citation. It's a really good way to take our discussion a step further, bulk up and support your statements with evidence, moving it from a conversation into a real academic discussion. So we do have a discussion topic just as we've been doing. And then there is an activity. It's called IDEA Regulations, Find and Define. So we'll be talking through that assignment as well, because it will be submitted for credit. There are two different parts of Unit 3 included under modules. And again, as we've discussed, that's not because one is first or more important than the other, but simply because the content just needs to be separated a little bit because of the different areas of emphasis. So here we'll be talking through the law, Section 504, and ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. I believe most of you are already aware of how to access feedback on assignments, but there is a link here with information about how to do that in Canvas. I will be providing comments on papers and assignments that you submit. So we will be talking about 504 and Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, and then comparing these to IDEA. There are several documents here added for you to look at. Now, we won't go into the law too deeply here because, as you can see, there's a great deal of detail included in this visual that you can review on your own time. But what I will mention is, typically, I'll just give a brief overview here. IDEA, obviously, is our special education law. It is the rock and the foundation of everything we do in the field. It is our guidance when we are not sure of the best step to take or how to proceed, and we supplement that statutory law with case law so that we gather the big picture of legal expectations and requirements for us as special education staff members and employees within the field. The ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, prohibits, as it says here, prohibits discrimination, and that's in the employment setting, public services, and does consider accommodations as well. So there's a lot of different areas in which ADA will come about, and you can scroll down if you want to look at this component here. Which of these connect to free appropriate public education and how. So obviously IDEA is the boss of all of that, but 504 does have a connection to educational setting as well. And listed here, the Americans with Disabilities Act doesn't directly relate to free and appropriate public education, but as you read up, you'll see that there are connections to these. Additionally, ADA is going to generally be focused on employment. It's focused on an enormous number of things, including how we're building a building and whether a person who's using a wheelchair could get around it. That's just something that comes to mind when you consider ADA, and what kind of funding is provided for that building and the agencies or entities therein, and whether they are compliant with ADA standards for access and parking and all of those different variables. But when it comes to working with students, ADA is also something we need to be aware of, particularly for those pursuing post-secondary employment or training. In the employment setting, as long as the student, then becoming a young adult, can perform the duties of the job with or without reasonable accommodation, that person should not be discriminated against and should have just as good of a chance getting and keeping the job as anybody else would. Okay, so you'll see a lot of ADA principles coming up in those settings. IDEA, as we've discussed, obviously, is special education 3 through 21, so it covers that enormous age span. And here listed are a large number, several different categories under which students can be eligible for special education services. And then the 504 area of the law is particularly focused on educational accommodations. A child may not be eligible for special education, but still could have a 504 plan. And so there is a group of people that would be working on that 504 plan. Oftentimes a school counselor might be involved, but the IDEA or the special education plan is going to be generally much more extensive than that. So you'll see several different other categories here. For instance, as mentioned, the comprehensive evaluation, if we're talking about more extensive, that would be the process to become eligible or remain eligible for special education for an IEP. But then here in the 504, it would be notice for evaluation, not consent. And so it's just a little bit different. There's not a meeting required for a change in placement in 504. And so as you scroll down, you'll see a variety of different topic areas related to all three of these types of law and the protections that fall under these. Please notice here as well that funding from IDEA, special education funding for that in particular, cannot be used to serve children that are eligible with a 504. More information here for you regarding those topics. And here is the law itself in PDF form, section 504. You'll see it's quite lengthy, so you won't be wanting to go perhaps through the entire thing word for word, but it's good to become familiar with it. You'll be scrolling down, just review the language. There's also a presentation included for you here, and it focuses on the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. So the objectives for the presentation, if you take the time to review it, would just be going over different special education law. And obviously we're talking about students with disabilities in any of these areas as we're looking at the school setting. And primarily IDEA, but it's important to understand the others as well. So IDEA would be for students with delay or disability. And as we just looked at in that previous document, many different categories, such as a specific learning disability, other health impairment, which could be related to a number of things. Oftentimes we'll see other health impairment going along with ADHD. So you might be eligible under a serious emotional disability, or perhaps with multiple disabilities, a speech language impairment, or a couple of those eligibility categories at one time, with one of those being the primary. Could be autism spectrum disorder, many different things that can cause a child to become eligible for special education services. There are two important parts to the law. Obviously here we are focused on the law in general and then applications as we do the assignments. But the focus on 0 to 3 years is separate than the focus on 3 to 21, which would be the traditional public school setting, whether that's early childhood, elementary, middle, or high school, or transition programming for students up to age 21. So for eligibility, there will be evaluation, and that was just mentioned. In IDEA for special education, we're doing a comprehensive evaluation. We'll need to look at all relevant categories, areas of a concern, and really just establish those baselines so that then for the goal areas that we identify, we can develop the IEP. And for children in this younger age group, it would be called an IFSP, Individualized Family Service Plan. You can research that further, but in relation to the IEP, which is the area focus at this moment, that will be developed by the multidisciplinary team based on the results of a comprehensive and exhaustive evaluation that has really looked into each and every area of need for that student and the impacts of those areas of need on education and educational access. That is obviously the most important focus for all of this. Access to education, a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. So students at age 2 may start planning for transitioning to some programming for those older students, for instance, looking into perhaps some preschool options and resources for the family. But students in the high school setting or even the middle school setting will start to work with 15 plus IEPs, planning for transition. Obviously, students can be older and younger than this, and still transition planning would be relevant. So what kinds of services would be investigated? What kinds of agencies can we connect with? And how can we smoothly transition the student out of the school system and out of those four walls into the world at large with as much independence and self-determination as possible? Obviously, parents and families, guardians should be aware of their rights and receive those procedural safeguards with explanation in a language that is familiar to them, obviously with their first and most fluent language, and then using terminology that's appropriate. So there are several websites that are linked here. Please, as we know and have discussed, we cannot throw acronyms at family members. It's so easy to do because we talk like that in the field. We talk like that to each other. Oh, is this the LRE? We might discuss about a student, and nobody stops to define that. We need to be more careful when it comes to parents and families who may not be familiar with these terms. So, rehabilitation. There's more information here, particularly Section 504, which is what we were just talking about. So then the states can determine the impairment and limitation. And as you can see, this is just different from the IEP, but it still would be a support plan. So you're going to see a lot of accommodations in here, how the subject matter might be presented, or accommodations such as extended time. So as with IDEA and special education or IEPs, we would explain the law to families and make sure that they're aware of their rights and of these resources. In the Americans with Disabilities Act, which we hit on previously, ADA, more information here about the value of ADA in transition, and particularly in colleges. This can be something valuable in Section 504, making sure that students are in communication with disability support services or student support services at any college or post-secondary institution that they might be investigating. And then this is more information regarding the law and resources that are available to youth with disabilities. When it comes to transition programming or community-based supports, a family might investigate a community center board, a developmental disability resource center might be appropriate, and those are different depending on the county that the family lives in. And each state and area has this set up a little bit differently, but there are a lot of options for transportation and for experiences for people with disabilities in the community after they have exited high school. So transition programming can be helpful with that. There's a video clip for you as well that you can review at the end. So more resources on the ADA. We've talked through that at length here in this video already. And then in part 2, we'll be looking at IDEA in particular. It's just important that you know the differences between these. So you'll have a history of IDEA here. This is a really beautiful history to review. It is a 25-year history and the major accomplishments made. So you'll read about how things were before IDEA and unfortunately the very poor treatment of people with disabilities, the lack of access. So this really is a beautiful law, and if you think about it in the big picture, it can bring a tear to your eye. Just the justice, the social justice of education, and the incredible nature of this law, and how far we've come as a society and as educators, but how far we still have to come for all of us. This is a PowerPoint presentation related to intellectual aptitude, talking about the concept of IQ. So that's a valuable resource to review as well. More information on the reauthorizations of IDEA. It's good to be familiar with these and the most recent IDEA components. So this will be valuable to you. These links may help you on the discussion board as well. So that is IDEA information. Again, we talked about statutory versus case law. So you'll need to cite each of those in the You Be the Judge assignment, which is coming up. So please make sure you know the difference between those. Case law being reference to a case that supports the ruling or decision that you want to make, and then statutory law being the regulations, the law itself, kind of the meat and potatoes, I would say, or the bones of the law. And then case law can fill in the gaps. So this is a discussion about how IDEA has impacted you or the students you work with. Obviously, either of those might be pretty easy to answer because it is the foundation of special education. And then this is our regulation assignment, find and define. So you'll be going through each of these. You'll be looking in the law for each of these regulations. You'll be defining these terms, citing where you found them, and there is an example given to you here. Any questions? Let me know. Have a great week.